On January 27, 1967, three American astronauts burned to death inside their spacecraft while it sat on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy. They weren't in space. They weren't even attempting to launch. They were just running a routine test, something they'd done dozens of times before. But in less than 15 seconds, a flash fire consumed the pure oxygen atmosphere inside the Apollo 1 command module, and Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were gone. NASA didn't just lose three astronauts that day. They lost their innocence, their invincibility, and nearly lost the entire race to the moon. What makes this tragedy so disturbing isn't just that it happened, but how predictable it was. The Apollo 1 crew had been complaining for weeks about the command module's problems. Gus Grissom, a veteran astronaut who'd already flown in space twice, was so frustrated with the spacecraft's constant malfunctions that he hung a lemon on it as a joke. Think about that. A man who trusted his life to rockets was making dark jokes about his own spacecraft because he knew something was wrong. The day before the fire, he told his wife that if there was ever a serious accident in the space program, it would likely be him. 24 hours later, he was dead. The test they were running wasn't even supposed to be dangerous. It was called a plugs-out test, essentially a dress rehearsal, where the spacecraft would run on internal power to simulate launch conditions. No fuel was loaded. The rocket beneath them wasn't active. By every official measure, this was one of the safest tests in the entire Apollo program. But NASA had made a series of decisions that turned a routine exercise into a death trap. And those decisions reveal something deeply uncomfortable about how the agency operated during the space race. First, they filled the cabin with pure oxygen at a pressure higher than the outside atmosphere. Pure oxygen makes everything burn faster and hotter. A spark that would barely singe fabric in normal air becomes an inferno in pure oxygen. NASA knew this. They'd seen fires in oxygen-rich environments before during testing. But they chose pure oxygen anyway because it was simpler, lighter, and had worked in the Mercury and Gemini programs. The fact that those earlier capsules were much smaller and had quick-release hatches apparently didn't factor into their risk assessment for Apollo. Second, the hatch design was a nightmare. It opened inward, which meant the pressure inside the cabin during the fire would press it shut like a sealed tomb. It also required multiple steps to open, taking at least 90 seconds under perfect conditions. Ed White was the strongest astronaut in the program, a man who'd performed America's first spacewalk, and even he couldn't get that hatch open while fire raged around him. The engineers knew the hatch was problematic. Gus Grissom had personally complained about it, but NASA had made the decision to prioritize a hatch that wouldn't accidentally blow open in space over one that could save lives in an emergency on the ground. Third, the spacecraft was filled with flammable materials. Velcro covered surfaces throughout the cabin because it was a convenient way to secure objects in zero gravity. Nylon netting was everywhere. Coolant lines containing flammable glycol ran exposed through the cabin. In a pure oxygen environment, these materials were essentially kindling, waiting for a spark. NASA's own safety protocols had been ignored or waived to meet aggressive timelines set by President Kennedy's deadline to land on the moon before the decade's end. The fire started at 6:31 p.m. The first indication was Grissom's voice saying, "Fire." Not panicked, just stating a fact. 2 seconds later, it was Roger Chaffee screaming, "We've got a fire in the cockpit!" Ed White tried desperately to open the hatch while flames consumed the cabin. Outside, technicians and engineers watched helplessly through a small window as the three men struggled against an enemy that moved faster than human reaction time. The pressure inside the cabin built so rapidly that the command module ruptured, spewing smoke and flames into the white room surrounding the spacecraft. By the time the hatch was finally opened, all three astronauts were dead. What happened next is where NASA's handling becomes truly controversial. The immediate aftermath was chaos and grief, which is understandable. But the subsequent investigation revealed a pattern of institutional failure that many argue NASA tried to minimize and bury. The official investigation board identified multiple causes, including the pure oxygen atmosphere, flammable materials, vulnerable wiring, and inadequate emergency procedures. But here's what they didn't emphasize. Dozens of people had raised concerns about these exact issues and were either ignored or overruled. Engineers had warned about the oxygen environment. Technicians had documented wiring problems. The astronauts themselves had complained about quality control issues so severe that Grissom once said, "How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings?" He was referring to communication failures during testing, but the comment captured a larger truth. NASA was moving so fast that basic competence was becoming optional. The agency was under enormous pressure from Congress, the White House, and the public to beat the Soviets to the moon. Every delay was seen as a failure, every caution as cowardice. What makes the Apollo 1 fire particularly hard to accept is that it was entirely preventable. This wasn't a random mechanical failure or an unforeseeable accident. Every single factor that contributed to the deaths of those 3 men was known, documented, and preventable. The choice to use pure oxygen, the decision on the hatch design, the presence of flammable materials, the vulnerable wiring, these were all conscious decisions made by intelligent people who understood the risks. They chose speed over safety, ambition over caution, and 3 men paid with their lives. NASA's response was to implement sweeping changes to the Apollo program. They redesigned the hatch to open outward in seconds. They removed flammable materials and replaced them with fire-resistant alternatives. They improved wiring and quality control procedures. They even changed the atmosphere to a nitrogen-oxygen mixture during ground testing. These changes worked. No other astronaut died in a fire during the Apollo program. But this raises an obvious question. If NASA could make these changes after the fire, why couldn't they have made them before? The answer is uncomfortable, but simple. They didn't think they needed to, until people died. Some argue that NASA didn't try hard enough to learn from previous warning signs. There had been a serious fire during ground testing in 1965 that nearly killed 2 astronauts in a pure oxygen chamber. That should have been the wake-up call. Instead, the lessons were confined to that specific test environment rather than applied across the program. There's a pattern in institutional failures where organizations learn just enough to address the immediate problem, but not enough to prevent the next variation of the same disaster. The families of Grissom, White, and Chaffee handled their grief with remarkable dignity, but they also asked hard questions. Grissom's widow publicly questioned whether NASA had done enough to protect the astronauts. Years later, some family members would suggest that important details about the fire and the conditions leading up to it had been downplayed or omitted from official narratives. Whether that constitutes NASA trying to forget the accident or just an organization trying to move forward is a matter of interpretation. What's undeniable is that Apollo 1 changed NASA permanently. The agency became more cautious, more systematic, and more willing to speak up about safety concerns. The flight director, Gene Kranz, gave a speech after the fire, where he told his team that they had been too confident, too comfortable with success, and that complacency had killed 3 men. He introduced the phrase tough and competent as the standard for mission control, meaning they would be technically excellent, but also willing to face hard truths. That culture shift, born from tragedy, arguably saved lives during Apollo 13 and countless other missions. But we shouldn't let the eventual success of the Apollo program erase the fundamental questions raised by Apollo 1. How many warning signs can an organization ignore before tragedy becomes inevitable? When does ambition cross the line into recklessness? And what does it say about us that we needed to see 3 men die before we took safety seriously? The Apollo 1 fire wasn't an accident in the sense of being unpredictable. It was the inevitable result of decisions that prioritized schedule and prestige over the lives of the people inside the spacecraft. Gus Grissom once said that if we die, we want people to accept it as the nature of exploring space, not because of carelessness or neglect. The cruel irony is that he died exactly the way he hoped he wouldn't. Not exploring space, but sitting in a flawed spacecraft on the ground, killed by risks that everyone knew existed, but nobody had the courage to fully address. NASA didn't try to forget Apollo 1, but they did try to ensure it represented a turning point rather than a pattern. Whether they succeeded is still being debated every time we discuss acceptable risk in human spaceflight.